I'm going to introduce my colleagues here first and foremost. Madeline Cheragino, our Government Relations Director, is going to join me in hosting this conversation today. And our guest, Jessica Montel. We are very pleased to have you. For those of you who aren't lucky enough to know her already, I'll give a brief introduction. Jessica is the Executive Director of Hamoked, a really, really fabulous Israeli organization otherwise known as the Center for the Defense of the Individual. And you may know her in that role. You may know her from her previous role years as the Executive Director of Bethlehem, or from the, frankly, good amount of time that that she, along with some of us, have been spending working on this issue now. And Jessica is really one of the deep experts on what really matters when we talk about these issues, which is the details. You know, it's easy to talk big picture, it's easy to talk about the politics, but when it gets down to really helping people and really trying to impact people's lives and those that are most impacted by the occupation, the people whose homes are being demolished, the people who are being expelled, people dealing with the Israeli bureaucracy and in the Israeli legal and military legal systems, Jessica and Hamoked are really the experts, and we are grateful to have you with us today. So hello.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Madeline now to get us started.
Yeah, so let's just jump straight into, what COGAT is and these rules and things like that. But before we get into these new rules, would you mind telling folks a little bit about what COGAT is and the kinds of restrictions we've already seen, and then going into how these rules will be changing, expanded with the new guidelines when they're implemented in July. Also, as a side note, I understand this new set of rules is 97 pages long, while the previous set was 4 pages. And I'm just curious how much of this is codifying existing discriminatory practices versus implementing new practices.
Yes, so thanks for that. I say one word about Hamoked, which is an Israeli human rights organization with a focus on providing individual assistance to Palestinians. And increasingly over the years, it's 30 years that Hamoked has been working initially on issues of violence and detention and other of the sort of dramatic events you read about in the headlines. Over the years, the work has really evolved to be focusing on the bureaucracy of occupation. And I think that says a lot about, what occupation actually is for a majority of Palestinians. It's a permit bureaucracy. You need a permit for almost everything, all sorts of things that we Israelis or you Americans take for granted. Living in your own home, traveling from point A to point B, having a family gathering, really the day-to-day life. So then this new regulation, which Madeline, as you said, 97 pages, the regulation is to regulate the title procedure for entry and residence of foreigners in the West Bank. But of course, it has really important implications for Palestinian society and Palestinian institutions and Palestinian families who are hosting those foreigners. So first, what you need to know is that a person coming to visit Israel, their entry is governed by the Israeli Ministry of Interior. A person going to the West Bank, their entry is governed by the Israeli military. The Israeli military is the government, the legislature and the executive, and the judiciary in the West Bank. And Madeline, you're really right that a lot of these new, what has been codified into 97 pages has been, unwritten practice that has emerged over the past few years. And then we and others that have been challenging these regulations and saying, where is it written, all of these restrictions, all of this basis for denying all sorts of people entry into the West Bank. Now they've come and codified that, and they've also added a lot of new things that were not in practice before. So first of all, who is affected by this? The regulations are talking about entry to the West Bank for students at Palestinian universities, for faculty at Palestinian universities, for people who want to work or volunteer at any Palestinian institution, and also for investors. And then there's a whole category for spouses of Palestinians, and I'll talk about that separately. But those are the only categories. Those are the only reasons that people can get a visa to come into the West Bank. Somebody who comes to visit Israel and the West Bank together is outside of these regulations. That's called a mixed entry visa, and that would be governed by the Ministry of Interior. So if you're coming as a tourist to visit, the West Bank and Israel, you would go through the regular channels of visiting Israel. But if you're just coming to the West Bank, let's say for a cultural visit, for a tourism visit, for a religious pilgrimage, there is now no longer any way to get a visa to come to the West Bank solely for those purposes. So whole categories are excluded from the regulations. Now, somebody could land at Ben Gurion Airport and just come in as a tourist to Israel. I mean, plenty of people up until now who plan to go to the West Bank, they, slip in through the cracks, but increasingly people are subject. Anyone who for any reason is a flag for those people screening at the airport, they ask you, what's the purpose of your visit? If you say, I'm going to my church in Ramallah, or I'm visiting a cultural institution in Nablus, no, you will be told that you should have applied 60 days earlier for a special visa, again, which isn't even possible for those purposes. But let's talk about the people who have been coming in, let's say students. I mean, what is new? I'll just outline. First, let me say 97 pages. It should be clear. You're talking about a micromanagement of Palestinian society. I mean, that's the headline that I would give to this, because there are all sorts of things that should not be under the purview of the Israeli military and the Israeli Ministry of Defense, to be setting criteria for who you can offer a teaching position to at a faculty at a Palestinian university. How many students can a Palestinian university host? Which institutions can receive volunteers? All of those things the military should not be dictating. And I take one step back to say, the legal framework for everything the military does in the West Bank, by law, there are two arms in terms of the legal authority of the Israeli military. One is for its own security necessity, and the other is for the welfare of the local population. So, of course, an individual foreigner who raises any security concerns, the military can deny them entry. But to set a quota of 150 foreign students, which is what the new regulation does for the first time, explicitly sets that quota, obviously there's no security need for a quota on students at Palestinian universities. Obviously, it is not in the best interest of Palestinian society. So those sorts of, invasive regulations of the military are quite infuriating. And I say another new, something that has been enforced more or less in a sort of haphazard way, but now is written black on white, is a very explicit discrimination. This policy applies to foreigners coming in from all countries that have diplomatic relations with Israel, with the exception of 5. Jordan, Egypt, Bahrain, South Sudan, and Morocco are outside of these regulations. They can only come to visit if there's a special visit to the Palestinian Authority permit that's given really in exceptional humanitarian considerations. Basically, those 5 categories cannot come to the West Bank to be a volunteer, a student, a teacher, an investor. There's no visa process for them. And what this policy says is, if you have 2 different passports, you're that. If you have a Jordanian passport and an American passport, you're a Jordanian for the purpose. So what that means basically is, who are the people with Jordanian passports? Those are descendants of Palestinians. You have a whole class of, grandchildren of Palestinians who have a Jordanian national ID number. For the purposes of this procedure, they're not Americans, they're Jordanians, and they will not be able to study or teach or volunteer or come for any reason. And then I want to take just 1 minute to talk about the whole other class of people that are affected by this procedure. You have tens of thousands of foreigners married to Palestinians. Again, I say foreigners, a lot of them are Palestinian refugees that are coming from Jordan, but originally, you know, their grandparents' village is in the West Bank. Or you have, you know, non-Palestinian Europeans and Americans who fell in love with Palestinians and married them and moved here. And this procedure also governs them, because there's a whole separate procedure that I'm happy to talk about, because it's equally infuriating, about not granting family unification to Palestinians. Israel has taken unilateral control, although this is contrary to the Oslo Accords, about granting any legal status to spouses. You know, a person could be married to a Palestinian and living in the West Bank for 30 years, own a home, have children, work in a Palestinian institution, and never be granted the status of, you know, get a Palestinian ID. The only way they can stay here legally is through this visa system. But the new procedures are much, much more restrictive on those couples. What it says is you can get a visa for 3 months, maybe extend for another 3 months, and then that's it. If you want to apply for another visa, you have to leave and stay abroad for a period of 6 months before you can even ask to come back. Now, you have tens of thousands of people living, quote unquote, illegally. As far as Israel is concerned, they're illegal aliens in the West Bank because they've overstayed their visa. The new procedure now sets these security guarantees. You would have to deposit something like $20,000. You get a visa to come and live with your husband and children in your own home. In the West Bank, you're going to have to deposit $20,000 as a guarantee that you leave after 6 months. So it's I mean, I think it's a whole separate issue, the denial of families the ability to live together, as opposed to all of the other categories which really affect, I mean, of course, it's affecting Americans who want to come to the West Bank, but of course also affecting the Palestinian economy, the Palestinian academic community, Palestinian society as a whole.
There's so much in this.
Did I overwhelm?
No, I mean, you're not the one who overwhelmed. Thank you, first of all. You know, there are a lot of pieces in here that I think are really important for us to come back to. I want to talk about the family reunification issue, which to me is sort of the most glaring, or one of the most glaring, I should say, of the humanitarian issues here. Definitely, we want to come back and dig in a little bit more as to what this means for Americans, and maybe look at what this means vis-a-vis the US and Israeli government. But first, I just have to go back to what you were saying about I don't know if it was 5 or 6 countries who are not part of this, including Jordan. So I gotta be honest, and I don't know if anybody else was with me on this. When you started listing those countries, I actually thought you were gonna say it's better for those countries, right? Because those are countries, some of them, at least the beginning of that list, that have closer relationships with the Israeli government, long-time peace, Abraham Accords, all kinds of different stuff. And then when you said that, in fact, it's worse for those, and that the Jordanians, who, again, so many of those people who we're talking about are, of course, Palestinians, like you said, whose families, you know, have been in Jordan for a generation or two. That part to me is just shocking for, you know, a country with which Israel is supposed to be improving its relationships under this last government, and however long that lasts is a different issue. But and where, you know, we hear all the time about, oh, we want to find international funding for joint Israeli, Jordanian, or maybe Palestinian projects. You know, we want to improve. We see complaints in Jewish press all the time about, you know, is Jordan, you know, part of some sort of cultural boycott against Israeli institutions? And yet here we have a regulation that would be keeping, I presume that's probably the largest number, right? Jordanians of Palestinian descent out of the country under this. So tell me a little bit more about that, and what has Jordan had to say about this? What's that done around the bilateral relationship?
Yes. So you're right that in terms of the people who would want to come, the biggest population is Jordanians, and of those tens of thousands of spouses living here with no legal status, a majority are Jordanian Palestinians. the rationale, I mean, how could they possibly, I have not seen any written justification. It's an odd, Jordan, you could understand maybe, but I mean, I can't even explain to you how South Sudan and Morocco, I don't know how they got added, except those are it's Arab countries with diplomatic relations with Israel. Those people could come to Israel, welcome to come to Israel to invest or study at Tel Aviv University. It's only we want to keep you from having relations with Palestinian institutions and Palestinian society. I haven't seen any statements from the government of Jordan or others regarding this policy.
Wow. And one other question, Madeline, then I'll turn it over to you. But you mentioned the quota of 150 students, but tell me a little bit more. 150 per what? What does that mean?
150 students per year, and there's also a quota on faculty, 100 faculty per year. Again, where does this number come from? It has no relationship to the actual numbers, and the only indication, I don't know how many total foreign students or lecturers are at Palestinian universities right now. I can only tell you how many are coming from the European Union. The European Union has a program called Erasmus+, which is supporting Europeans to come to universities throughout, the Mediterranean region. So coming to Israeli institutions, it's last time the numbers that I saw, something like 1,600 Europeans are studying or teaching in Israeli universities. And the same program, you have 366 Europeans in Palestinian universities. So these quotas are not enough, even for the Erasmus Plus participants. It is infuriating as a, sort of slap in the face to Europe. We're very happy for you to fund people coming to Israeli institutions, but we're going to be drastically restricting the ability of Europeans to come to Palestinian institutions.
Wow. Okay.
Thank you, Jessica. I want to go back to the point you made about how this is kind of codifying the existing discriminatory practices. And I was curious, one, how activists in Israel are pushing back. And then in addition, if these practices were already in place in like an ad hoc manner prior to the rule change, is it almost more helpful from an advocacy perspective to be able to point to what is now clearly written out guidance instead of having to rely on anecdotal evidence?
Yes. So, at this stage, first I have to say the regulations are supposed to come into force in early July. So we're at a good point, and I'll reiterate this toward the end in terms of the ability to be influencing policy. It's not already in force, set in stone, that would require Israel to, back down. And we have sent already our concerns to the Ministry of Defense and asked them to amend, very drastically amend these procedures. They informed us that they were postponing by another 45 days. It was originally supposed to come into force in May. They said they're postponing for another 45 days to consider our objections and other. We know that many others have also, including the US government and others, have voiced objections. So it's very helpful to have written in black on white, let's say, this discrimination against certain types of American citizens. Of course, it's helpful to have that written black on white to be advocating against these regulations.
So, you mentioned the date and talking about the US government and its thoughts. The announcement has now been officially made that President Biden will be visiting Israel starting July 13th, I believe. And, we have done, we've been involved in conversations both congressionally, maybe Madeline will get to that in a minute, but also with folks in the administration around this. And I think it's fair to share, without getting into the details, that I've heard from a number of senior government officials that the US government is very unhappy about this. that they look at, I mean, I think they're unhappy about it broadly speaking, but particularly, you know, they look at how this is going to impact American citizens. And you said something just a minute about, you know, certain different kinds of American citizens, because obviously it's not fair, but the US government, at least theoretically, looks at all American citizens as the same. And those citizens should be treated the same by foreign countries. And one of the questions that this brings to mind for me is, you know, the question of the visa waiver program that Israel has for a long time been lobbying quite extensively, trying to become part of the US visa waiver program. It seems, I would think, rather counterintuitive that they would do this at a time, again, when it's going to be highlighted by the president's visit, but do this at a time when they're trying to become part of that visa waiver program. Do you think they took that into mind? I mean, why do you think they're doing this right now, I guess, is part of that question. And, you know, do you think that this opportunity with the bright light of the president's visit might help, you know, help raise the objections?
Yes, it is hard to imagine that they took the visa waiver program into consideration and still formulated these regulations. I can only assume, you know, the defense ministry people working on these regulations are siloed from the foreign ministry and, you know, maybe the prime minister's office pushing the inclusion into the US visa waiver. Because, you know, as it was, there was discussion about discrimination against Palestinian-Americans and maybe Arab Americans in general coming in. I mean, the experience of a Jewish American landing at Ben Gurion Airport is not at all the experience of a Palestinian-American. It's a very blatant racial profiling and then being subjected to, you know, really invasive interrogation. So that already was a concern in terms of negotiations around the visa waiver. But then this adds a whole level of, you know, again, it's not under the table sort of informal, unstated profiling. It's very explicit discrimination. So and the visa waiver to be included in the visa waiver program requires reciprocity. The way we treat your citizens is the way you treat our citizens. There cannot be a discrimination within different kinds of American citizens. As you said, for the US government, Americans are Americans. So I think the Biden visit is a great opportunity. I mean, I know there is negotiation around, you know, a package of decisions, announcements, gestures that would be made in the context or ahead of that visit. So I think this is a great issue to add to the list, that the Ministry of Defense would, you know, announce that they are scrapping this whole procedure and instead putting in place a much more, you know, fair and respectful of Palestinian society procedure.
Thank you, Jessica. You know, Hadar noted a few of, he noted that there have been some congressional letters about this, even one from Representative Wexton, another one of 12 members of Congress in May, led by Representative Bowman, and then just last week, Representatives Ocasio-Cortez, Tlaib, and McCollum led a letter calling in on Mayorkas and Blinken, expressing concerns and saying that it might render it ineligible for the visa waiver program. But these rules don't, as you pointed out, don't just apply to American citizens. And I'm curious how other countries, you mentioned the Erasmus program, how they've taken the news and what their pushback has been. Maybe there's particularly lessons learned from them that we can, you know, put into action here in the United States.
Yes, I mean, for the Europeans, well, I would say for the Americans as well. I mean, violating human rights should be a concern. You know, violating the human rights of Palestinians has to be part of the US-Israel conversation, regardless of the impact. You know, there's the consular services conversation, and there's, you know, just the diplomatic conversation around expecting Israel to uphold all of its legal obligations and respect human rights. And the same is true of Europe. So particular countries are concerned about their own nationals. You know, the fact that you have your own nationals living in the West Bank married to Palestinians, the fact that you have students and faculty and other people that are coming here. But also Europe hopefully is concerned about what this means for Palestinian society in general. Europe is investing in Palestinian universities, building up strengthening Palestinian universities. This measure is obviously a blow to academic freedom. I mean, the levels, again, of micromanagement, which are priority fields that people will be allowed to come and teach, what are the academic credentials, when you need a master's and when you need a PhD within this visa to extend from a 1-year visa to a 2-year visa. The fact that it's not the university making that decision, but some clerk in the Ministry of Defense is outrageous and of course will harm academic institutions. Palestinian universities need to be free to, recruit the best faculty from around the world, to be offering tenure to faculty from around the world, but offering tenure means that you can guarantee they will be able to stay permanently in the West Bank. What about their spouse and children? Will they be able to stay permanently? Currently, it's a maximum of 27 months of a foreign faculty, again, in fields that have been defined as high priority for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. The most you can get is a 27-month visa. So of course you can't offer tenure to, a really excellent faculty member that's super important to the academic development of your department. So that should be a concern. I mean, it can't be, that Europe is on the one hand trying to be strengthening Palestinian academia, and on the other hand, allowing the Israeli Defense Ministry to be curtailing academic freedom.
Thank you. So I want to take a couple of the questions that we've got from participants, and there's a theme here. So I'm going to bundle a few of these together and then you can answer them. And it's really a question, again, of trying to figure out who this applies to and how. And so there are a couple questions here. So one person asked, if a US citizen was coming for medical, it said to the PA to stay for a week in the Palestinian territories for a medical mission, would this apply to them? And then
Yes.
there's, right. And so then there's a different question, right, that goes along with this about, what about people who are Palestinian-Americans? And the question was asked about Omar Assad, who of course was killed, who came from Milwaukee to the West Bank. How would this apply to people in that category who were Palestinian-American citizens? And then the flip side of this, which I think is a really interesting question, is do the restrictions on foreign nationals entering the occupied territories also apply to Jewish settlers, right? What about Jews who are either dual citizens, as I am, for example, which you had said earlier, if you're a Jordanian and if you have dual passports, they consider you that thing. Does that apply to Jews as well? Or what about Jews that are not Israeli citizens? The many, many, many Americans who come to live and study in yeshivot, in settlements, et cetera. How does this impact them? Or if not, what's the sort of explanation around that?
Yes. So this procedure applies to anyone who is not an Israeli citizen or a Palestinian resident. So if an American who is in the Palestinian population registry does not need a visa to come to the West Bank. It applies to everyone else except to the people who are excluded and prevented from visiting, but it applies to everyone else coming to Palestinian society, married to Palestinians, coming to Palestinian cities, coming to Palestinian institutions. A student from the United States, Jewish or not, who wants to go to Ariel University in the settlement of Ariel, is not governed by this procedure. They are free to come through the Israeli Ministry of Interior. The Israeli Ministry of Interior, rolls out the welcome mat for foreign students. You just need to show that you've been accepted into a program. You get a visa for a year if you're going, it's to Tel Aviv University or to Ariel College in the settlement. You can stay if you're in a 4-year degree program, you can stay for 4 years. If it's a 5-year degree program, you can stay for 5 years. So, there's all sorts of levels of discrimination, but, there definitely is a 2-tiered system for coming to study in the West Bank. Settlements is, the red carpet as far as Israel is concerned, and you don't even need to be talking to the Israeli Defense Ministry, as opposed to coming to Palestinian universities. I mean, what I didn't mention, the procedure for coming to a Palestinian university, you will be required to undergo an interview at the consulate nearest to your house. So, I mean, what is the content of that interview? The consular office within the embassies or consulates around the world will interview students, pass those interviews on to the Defense Ministry, and then the Defense Ministry makes up its list of approved students. Again, maybe 500 students are interested in coming, they have to make up a list of 150. What are the criteria any of us can sort of imagine in terms of who would be screened out from that interview process? So, basically anyone who is only coming to Palestinian society in the West Bank. If you're coming to Israel, if you're on a medical delegation that goes both to Tel Aviv and to Ramallah, this does not apply to you. If you're only coming to Ramallah, again, for any purpose, for a conference, for a week, for a month, for a year, for any purpose, you need to go through this process.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question from someone in chat asking what rationale the government used for these new laws. And then I also wanted to ask, do you know anything about the process in which it was adopted or formed? Has there been, some of it seems really hard to justify, frankly, but have there been attempts to justify it?
So the procedure was just issued in February. I know I have heard anecdotally from some European diplomatic missions that have registered their complaints. And, the people that they've spoken to in the Defense Ministry have been a little bit offended, that the response has been, we're trying to be transparent. And how come you never, we don't get any recognition of the fact that now we're being so transparent? Again, I think it indicates the way that they are in some little bubble, divorced from considerations of the outside world, how a procedure like this might look. But, part of the reality of the West Bank being under military occupation, the legislative process, if we can call it that, is very haphazard. A military commander signing a military order, that's the legislative process. So now, if the regulations are not drastically amended before they come into force in 2 weeks, we would petition Israel's High Court of Justice, and then the High Court of Justice would require them to justify. I would say in general, Hamuked is challenging all sorts of infuriating procedures, the closure on Gaza. Why is there no way for families to be meeting that are separated by the Gaza closure? Access to land beyond the separation barrier. Just this year, we had a success challenging, a crazy regulation that, in fact, I think I talked about last year in a webinar here. Why are they restricting people who have a small plot? They've decided that people with a small plot don't warrant a permit to cross the separation barrier and get access to their land. Why? Only when they came before the court, and then they had some garbled explanation about what is sustainable agriculture. Again, clerks who, probably have never farmed an olive grove in their life are setting these kinds of regulations. So we don't know how they're going to justify these regulations yet. Probably they will say that there is a problem of people overstaying their visas, because we know, again, thousands of people stay here with their families beyond their visas. So they'll say we need a way to be ensuring that people leave at the end of their visa. why it's for them to decide that you need a master's to be a lecturer at a university. It's hard to imagine how they will justify that.
So I'm going to ask one as a follow-up and then a separate question. So the follow-up to that is, you've talked about steps that Hamoket can take in terms of bringing this to the High Court. As this has been out in the public space, again, since February, we know this comes from COGAT, we talked about earlier, from the defense ministry, the military side of things. It's not from the legislative process of the Knesset. But what, if anything, have we heard from the political leaders in the Knesset? And I'd say specifically, have the parties on the left spoken up? Have they had anything to say about this? And is there anything that they can do about it, frankly, given that it is under military control?
Yes. We had a hearing last week in the Knesset. We, as the whole sort of family of organizations concerned about occupation, to mark 55 years of occupation. And I presented these regulations in that committee. So that was like the first effort to put it on the table. And now we're following up on that with members of Knesset submitting questions to the defense minister, asking for a hearing in the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee. And obviously there are implications for both halves of that committee's mandate. I mean, Israel's foreign relations and Israeli security and its responsibilities in the West Bank. So we would be pushing those channels. I mean, what can they do is a question that I'm sure every single webinar that you have had: settlement expansion, settler violence, forced dispossession of Palestinian communities. If the left-wing members of the coalition made this the deal breaker for the continuation of the coalition, of course, they would be successful in changing the regulations. But of course, this is not going to be the deal breaker. I mean, if, forced dispossession of 1,000 Palestinians from Masafer Yatta is not the deal breaker, then definitely these very bureaucratic, hard to understand regulations governing foreigners coming into the West Bank. I mean, is there something in between, half-hearted protest and pounding your fist on the table and saying it's all, putting all your cards? I would hope there would be something in the middle. I mean, there's no reason, there's no lobby unlike settlements where you really have, both halves of the government on opposing sides. I don't think there is a lobby, insisting on these restrictions on foreigners coming into the West Bank. So that should make it easier. But of course, I think it should be, it's not out of the question that the US administration, working together with European governments, would be able to make a real change. I mean, again, it should be something very straightforward. Again, given that we're talking both about violation of human rights obligations, but also a real discrimination and hardship for American citizens.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've talked about with leaders here, both folks in Congress and the administration, is, again, this connection between this and the visa waiver program, that, they are getting, members of Congress are getting lobbied by the embassy here or by other groups to push Israel's inclusion in the visa waiver program. And they've been very clear. Our position on it has been, we're all for Israel being included in the visa waiver program if and when, and only if and when, they meet the qualifications, which includes not discriminating against American citizens. So this would seem a very clear spot where hopefully, our collective voices can raise some of the objections and bring that foreign relations side of the foreign relations and security into view. I'm going to ask one specific follow-up question, and then I'll turn it over to Madeline in a moment. But one of our participants here said that they are planning on coming on an Eyewitness Palestine trip next year, and they want to know if that trip could be in jeopardy of not being able to happen because of these regulations.
Yes, a trip with the headline of "I Visit Palestine," unless the definition of Palestine includes 1948 Israel. If the definition of Palestine is the West Bank,
it's a fascinating little irony right there, isn't it?
Well,
yeah.
That trip would definitely need to request visas ahead of time. And there's no tourism clause for this. So in fact, I do not see, that's a great example. And I do not see how, with these new regulations coming into force, Eyewitness Palestine would be able to come to the West Bank.
So I want to note someone who is listed as an attendee, as an anonymous attendee. So I don't know who it is, but just wrote in the chat that they work for Eyewitness Palestine and that the trip will not be affected. So I don't know the details of that. And again, we don't have to go down that.
If you're coming as a tourist, to Israel and the Palestinian territories, these regulations will not affect you.
Gotcha.
But I wanted to say one thing about the visa waiver program, which is this principle of reciprocity. I think everyone, the most important point for Americans is that the US has to stand firm on the principle of reciprocity and non-discrimination. If the US stands firm on those principles, then the ball is in the court of the Israeli government. Do you really want to be included in the US visa waiver program, or it's not that important to you? It's your decision. But it can't be that it's a negotiation between the Israeli government and the US government. How much discrimination is the US administration willing to stomach?
That's a very good question, and one that we often ask.
Just to follow up on that, we have another question in the chat asking what would prevent someone from flying to Ben Gurion and basically not saying they're going to Palestine and then going.
Yes. You already have that situation. If someone is coming, either someone has a Palestinian last name, or somebody is known to have been active in Palestine solidarity activities in the United States, those people are flagged at the airport. And those people have been sent back in some cases. Even, under the current regulations, if you are active in BDS, as anyone who has worked on immigration issues in the United States knows, there is very, very broad discretion on allowing foreigners to come into your territory. There's no inherent right of anyone to go to a foreign country. So, Israel decides. Now, inside the state of Israel, that's an argument for Israelis to have, what sorts of restrictions are legitimate. But obviously, you can't be applying those same parameters when you're talking about Israeli control over people coming into Palestinian society. But the current situation is, plenty of people come in hoping to get in under the radar. Plenty of those people succeed, and some people don't. So is this new procedure going to mean a crackdown at the airport, that they're going to be much more restrictive? I don't know. But, the legal situation is, if you're going to Ramallah, again, starting next month, if you're coming to Ramallah for any reason, you should have asked for a visa ahead of time. Now, if you say, no, I'm going for a weekend at the beach in Tel Aviv and then going to Ramallah, again, are you going to get away with it, or you're not going to get away with it?
So, I know I'm sitting here kind of trying to think through all the implications and the details, and I see the questions coming in from the chat. People are doing the same as we're trying to figure out who this is going to impact and how. What about the press? And how is this going to, how might this impact foreign press who are coming to cover, what's taking place in the Palestinian territories? Obviously, this is, a topic that has been much in the news recently for horrible, horrible reasons. Is it possible that these regs are going to be used to crack down on press representation also?
Yes. Any press institution that has an office inside Israel is going to be asking for visas for their staff under the Israeli system, right? So if AP or Reuters, which has their headquarters in Jerusalem, all of their foreign staff would be the mixed visa, right? They're coming in to cover the situation in Israel and the West Bank. Any institution that's registered with the Israeli government press office can get away with not engaging with this new procedure. But Palestinian press institutions, an organization that has a headquarters in Ramallah obviously can't do that. And in fact, press is one of the lacuna in this procedure. There's no visa for press. So if a Palestinian press agency wants to hire foreign staff, there is no way that they can get a visa for foreign staff.
Fascinating. And that's something that, again, maybe obviously you knew the answer, but like I haven't heard that discussed at all yet as part of this. And, it just goes to show that the breadth of these regulations, and we know they're focused on family reunification issues and, and on the university pieces, but this, if it really goes into place, it's going to impact so many different things.
Yes. And I'll add another, and that's international organizations. International organizations, again, a big institution that has its headquarters in Jerusalem is not going to be affected. Humanitarian aid institution that has its headquarters in Jerusalem, even if it's Palestinian Jerusalem, because Israel has annexed East Jerusalem and Israeli law, they're applying Israeli law there. So any institution that has a headquarters in Jerusalem is going to be able to avoid these procedures. But an international development or humanitarian or aid institution with headquarters in Ramallah or in Nablus is going to have to go through this procedure for their staff and their volunteers.
And again,
so again, they will be governed by these
for that, right? Right.
No, for international organizations, there is a procedure. For if you're a worker or a volunteer in an organization, you can get a permit.
And does that also have a quota on it? Do you know?
No, there's no quota, but there are all sorts of guidelines. It's called experts and consultants in unique disciplines and senior employees. So you can ask for a permit, you get a short-term permit, you can ask for it to be extended, but there is a very firm limit on how long you can stay here. Now, even for Israel, international aid organizations that are headquartered in Jerusalem, the maximum is 5 years. I mean, that's why I just discovered this week that's why, you have a rotation in these international organizations that after 5 years, the senior staff, non-Palestinian staff have to leave. But in the West Bank, the maximum is 27 months. So that same institution, if their headquarters is in Ramallah, they bring in a project manager or a project director, they would only be able to stay here for a maximum of 27 months.
Wow. Madeline.
So mindful of the fact that we're running short on time, so I apologize if I'm about to open up another wormhole element of this, but in the reading and the reporting of these regulations and kind of what's being asked, what has been asked for these applications include like people listing out all associations and family members and potential property they could inherit. And there have been reports of people being required to log into their Gmail accounts and things like that. How common has this been? And is this really what it's going to look like going forward?
So the form that foreigners have to fill out is the same form. And already for the past few years, you have been required to detail if you have any land claims in the West Bank, if you stand to inherit any property. I mean, they're, odd questions for somebody who's asking to come to visit. They are questions, the students who are filling out the form to go study in the Ariel settlement or Tel Aviv University are obviously not asked these questions. It's not new, but it is a concern, in general, when we are asking for any kind of a permit for Palestinians. Let's say a Palestinian from the West Bank wants to go to a wedding in Gaza of family members. The military requires that they submit the name and phone number of all of those family members in Gaza. So, and it's clear there is, I don't know if fishing expedition is but definitely, let's say, an information gathering exercise. We know about all sorts of the surveillance technology being used in the West Bank, facial recognition, the fact that soldiers now have a quota, that they're photographing Palestinians and entering them into this database, the Blue Wolf database. So information gathering is, an auxiliary function of these forms. It's not new, but it definitely is very invasive questions that people are being asked.
I'm just shaking my head over and over again throughout this conversation.
I'm looking over, just to give you the examples, I looked for the actual form you have to fill out. Do you have a land or house in the area in the West Bank? Please specify. Do you own or are claiming inheritance in the area? Please specify. Do you have a criminal record? Of course, that's legitimate, and anybody would ask, any country that you're coming into. Those are sorts of, have you ever visited before? Did you stay beyond your last visa? Were you ever denied a visa? So, mixed in with what are legitimate questions to be asking when you're asking for a visa are things that are completely, invasive and infuriating.
I know you mentioned, it might have been before we started actually, that you and your organization have just put out a report on this. So first of all, I want to make sure we get that again. In English, yes? Is there an English version?
We haven't put out no. We sent our objections, a very detailed letter to the military with our objections.
Gotcha.
And then we would file a high court petition. I mean, again, they have, unless they come back next week with, a drastic amendment to these procedures, we would file a petition, and then we would, sort of summarize all of the, but on our website, there's just a 2-page position paper. Gotcha. Maybe that's the report that I referred to, just a sort of 2-page overview that I think Ori put in the chat.
Yes, I think he did, which is great. So one of the things that, I want to make sure that we do going forward, I know we've had you join us for congressional briefing that Madeline has organized in the past. I think this is frankly a really important opportunity to do so. Again, just like you had the chance to, present this to the Knesset members, we've been talking to, to a number of members of Congress who are definitely interested and definitely concerned about what this means on the human rights front and what this means for American citizens in particular. And I think, we're going to reach out for sure to find that opportunity to have you join us and talking to them and hopefully explain this to them so that we can help them raise their voices up. Great.
That's great.
Excellent.
I mean, I think I would say, I have 2 agendas in raising this issue. One, I want to, end this procedure, get this procedure very drastically amended. But I think it's a really useful, teachable moment, to everyone who thinks that occupation is just those, really dramatic events, or that everything that the Israeli military is doing, they're forced to do for security reasons. And it's all very complicated. This is a really good example of this micromanagement, that occupation is in fact this very invasive permit bureaucracy. I mean, as Madeline said at the beginning, it's helpful that they've laid it out for us in black and white to make this case to people who weren't aware of this level of micromanagement before.
Yeah, thank you. I want to welcome to our screen Jim Kutznick, the chair of Americans for Peace Now. Hi, Jim.
Thank you, Dar, and thank you, Jessica, for trying to explain something that's almost inexplicable. something that's Kafkaesque and Orwellian. And
Yes.
I have a specific question as it relates to the question of the visa waiver program and reciprocity. It seems to me that on the face of it, it won't make any sense, because if we allow Israelis to come in on a waiver under that program, then what does that mean for citizens of other countries? First of all, we have our own citizens who happen to be of different heritages, including obviously Palestinian. So how do you structure a reciprocal agreement where you have so many exceptions? And then if we were to, now I'm looking at it from the American government point of view, if we were to allow them under that program based on reciprocity, what does that say to the rest of the world, how we think about their citizens? Does it just say we're doing it selfishly so we in Israel can play games together, and we allow that to happen? I certainly, if that's the case, I don't know. First of all, I asked the question, Jessica, so I just want to see what your thoughts are in that regard.
No, I mean, it's a rhetorical question, because you're quite right that there can't be, reciprocity is, it's not a question of degree. Either we deal equally and fairly with all of your citizens, or we don't. So I think you're right. And I think you're right that there's a second level of, the US can't be only concerned about the treatment of its own citizens. That's crucial, that they look out for the interests of their own citizens and the principles of equality and non-discrimination. But as you said, of course, US interests and foreign policy interests have to be much broader than that. They can't be indifferent to, abuse of other citizens.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, certainly from our standpoint at APN, since we lobby our government for all kinds of things, this certainly to me would be a prime reason to say to them, don't do this. What do you want? You want to look like it's just a game between you and Israel and the world, and the rest of the world doesn't count? So anyhow, I was trying to formulate that question. I said, it'd be easier just to come on and, first of all, thank you and everybody who's listening in and make that point. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jim, thank you. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us. And again, we're going to continue to be in touch as we work on this and try to help take some of this explanation from today and share that with, our community leaders here, with elected officials, with folks in the administration. Madeline, thank you as always for helping to facilitate this conversation. And most importantly, thank you to everybody who joined us.